History records turning points not as dramatic explosions, but as quiet decisions made in unremarkable rooms. The end of American continental dominance arrived on a Tuesday morning in Ottawa, when Canadian officials signed a budget allocation that most observers dismissed as routine infrastructure spending. A $1.2 trillion sovereignty investment program spread across 5 years. Railway upgrades, port expansions, processing facilities. Nothing in the announcement suggested that this single policy choice would sever the economic relationships that had defined North America for 2 centuries. But empires do not fall to armies marching across borders. They fall when the fundamental assumptions underlying their power structure quietly become obsolete. And on that Tuesday morning, Canada made the decision that rendered obsolete the most basic assumption of American continental strategy, the assumption that Canadian resources would always flow south for American processing, American value addition, and American profit. For 200 years, this arrangement had functioned with mechanical precision. Canada extracted, America refined. Canada grew, America processed. Canada mined, America manufactured. The geographic logic seemed unshakable. American strategists built their continental dominance on the certainty that Canada would remain a resource periphery, a supplier of raw materials to the industrial core, a junior partner whose prosperity depended entirely on American market access. This dependency was carefully constructed through decades of trade agreements and infrastructure investments that channeled Canadian resources toward American processing facilities. Canadian oil flowed south through pipelines terminating at American refineries. Canadian minerals moved south on rail networks serving American manufacturing centers. The infrastructure itself became economic control. When your railways run north to south, when your pipelines flow toward foreign refineries, you are not sovereign over your resources. You are a tributary state disguised as an independent nation. American policymakers worked systematically to maintain this dynamic. Trade negotiations secured American access to Canadian raw materials while protecting American processing industries from Canadian competition. Investment policies encouraged Canadian extraction while discouraging domestic processing infrastructure. But systems that appear permanent often rest on assumptions that can shift overnight. In early 2025, those assumptions began crumbling with surprising speed. The catalyst was American miscalculation. When the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods in February 2025, American policymakers expected traditional responses. Canadian officials would negotiate. Business leaders would lobby for exemptions. Politicians would offer concessions. The tributary relationship would continue. Instead, Canada said no, not just the government, but the entire society. Canadian consumers stopped shopping in American stores. Businesses sought alternatives to American suppliers. Investors redirected capital toward domestic processing rather than raw material exports. The psychological shift was immediate and irreversible. Canadians began thinking about their relationship with the United States, not as natural economic integration, but as voluntary dependence that could be terminated. This transformation created political space for the sovereignty investment program that would restructure the North American economy. Canadian officials recognized that American tariffs had provided something invaluable: domestic support for economic independence. The budget allocation was systematic decoupling disguised as economic development. Every dollar strategically reduced dependence on American markets, processing capacity, and transportation networks. Railway investments focused on east-west corridors connecting Canadian resources to Canadian ports, bypassing American choke points. Port expansions handled the largest ships, providing direct global market access without American intermediation. The most transformative component was processing infrastructure. For the first time, Canadian policy prioritized domestic value addition over raw exports. Refineries, smelters, and manufacturing facilities captured full economic value within Canadian territory. Geography was deliberately chosen for irreversible strategic advantages. Churchill Port became North America's most valuable shipping terminal. Hudson Bay Railway created continental transportation, bypassing American territory. James Bay facilities refined critical minerals domestically rather than shipping south. Within 18 months, Canada built infrastructure for complete economic independence from American markets and processing. The investments were massive, rapid, and strategically coordinated. American officials watched with growing alarm as they recognized the implications. Canada wasn't diversifying its economy. Canada was building capability to cut economic ties with the United States entirely while maintaining full global market access. The panic became visible during USMCA review hearings in late 2025. American business leaders who dismissed Canadian infrastructure as inefficient government spending suddenly recognized Canada had built alternatives to every aspect of North American integration. Canadian wheat reached global markets through Churchill without American territory. Canadian oil flowed to international customers through Pacific terminals without American refinery processing. Canadian minerals were refined domestically and exported directly to European and Asian manufacturers. For the first time since the 19th century, Canada possessed complete independence from American economic relationships. This wasn't theoretical independence. This was operational independence backed by physical infrastructure. The mathematics of continental power had fundamentally changed. America could no longer assume Canadian resources would automatically flow south for American benefit. Canada could now choose its customers, set its prices, and direct its resources toward the highest bidders in global markets. More importantly, Canada had demonstrated something that American strategists had never seriously considered possible. A middle power with sophisticated planning, patient execution, and strategic timing could restructure continental relationships in ways that transferred economic leverage from larger neighbors to smaller ones. The historical parallels are instructive. Rome maintained control over its tributaries, not through constant military occupation, but through economic dependence that made rebellion economically suicidal. Egyptian grain flowed to Roman cities because Egypt had no alternative markets capable of absorbing its agricultural surplus. Germanic tribes provided raw materials to Roman manufacturers because they lacked the infrastructure to process those materials domestically. When those tributary relationships began to fracture, Roman power collapsed with remarkable speed. Not because Rome became militarily weaker, but because the economic relationships that sustained Roman dominance became optional rather than inevitable. Alternative trade routes developed. Local processing capabilities emerged. Tributary states discovered they could prosper without Roman intermediation. The American continental system had functioned according to identical principles for 2 centuries. Canadian resources flowed south not because of political agreements or military compulsion, but because Canada lacked viable alternatives to American markets and American processing capacity. The infrastructure of dependence made economic independence practically impossible regardless of political preferences. But infrastructure can be rebuilt, and once rebuilt, the psychology of dependence transforms into the psychology of choice. This transformation cannot be reversed through diplomatic negotiations or trade agreements because it rests on physical capabilities rather than political arrangements. The decision to build economic independence, rather than simply negotiate better terms within the existing system, represented a level of strategic thinking that American policymakers had consistently underestimated in their northern neighbor. Canada had recognized that true sovereignty required alternatives, not just better agreements with dominant partners. The execution revealed planning horizons that extended far beyond typical democratic political cycles. The Sovereignty Investment Program was not improvised in response to American tariffs. The infrastructure designs, financing mechanisms, and international partnerships had been developed over several years in anticipation of exactly the kind of crisis that emerged in early 2025. Canadian officials had studied the vulnerabilities of tributary economic relationships and systematically designed solutions that would provide genuine independence rather than cosmetic diversification. Every railway route, every port facility, every processing plant was positioned to maximize Canadian strategic autonomy while minimizing dependence on American cooperation or American market access. The international dimension of the strategy was equally sophisticated. While American foreign policy focused on bilateral relationships and regional dominance, Canadian diplomats were quietly building multilateral partnerships that would provide market access and technological cooperation without requiring exclusive alignment with any single great power. The European Union partnership agreements created preferential access to markets representing 450 million consumers without requiring Canada to choose between American and European relationships. The Asia-Pacific trade deals opened pathways to the fastest growing economic region in the world, while maintaining complete independence from Chinese political influence or American strategic constraints. These partnerships were carefully structured to prevent any single country or bloc from gaining the kind of leverage over Canada that the United States had exercised for 2 centuries. Canadian resources would flow to multiple markets. Canadian processing capabilities would serve diverse international customers. Canadian strategic autonomy would be protected through diversity rather than dependence. The psychological impact on American strategic thinking was profound and revealing. For generations, American policymakers had operated under the assumption that geographic proximity, cultural similarity, and economic integration made the Canadian relationship essentially permanent, regardless of political disagreements or policy conflicts. The discovery that Canada possessed both the capability and the willingness to restructure fundamental economic relationships shattered assumptions that had guided American continental strategy since the 19th century. Canada was not simply a friendly neighbor that could be taken for granted. Canada was a sophisticated strategic actor capable of independent decision-making that could dramatically alter the balance of continental power. American corporate responses revealed the extent of economic dependency that had developed over 2 centuries of integrated development. Automotive manufacturers discovered that single components crossed the Canadian border multiple times during production processes. making any disruption of Canadian relationships economically catastrophic for American manufacturing. Energy companies realized that American refinery infrastructure had been specifically designed to process Canadian heavy crude, making alternative supply sources prohibitively expensive to integrate. Agricultural processors found that seasonal labor patterns, transportation logistics, and distribution networks were optimized around Canadian supply chains that could not be quickly replaced. The dependencies were not limited to traditional resource sectors. Technology companies discovered that Canadian rare earth processing capabilities were essential for semiconductor production. Defense contractors found that Canadian manufacturers provided critical components for weapons systems considered essential to American national security. These revelations transformed the USMCA review from a routine trade negotiation into an exercise in American economic vulnerability assessment. Canadian negotiators arrived with detailed analyses of American dependencies and alternative partnerships that could replace American market access within 18 to 24 months. The negotiations revealed a fundamental role reversal that American officials were psychologically unprepared to accept. For the first time in continental history, Canada was negotiating from a position of strength, while the United States was seeking to preserve access to relationships it could no longer take for granted. Canadian officials were polite but implacable in their insistence that future economic relationships would be based on mutual benefit rather than tributary dependence. American market access would continue, but only on terms that preserved Canadian strategic autonomy and Canadian control over resource development decisions. The cultural transformation within Canada was equally significant and permanent in its implications. 2 centuries of economic integration had created Canadian business elites who identified their interests with American market access and American processing relationships. The Sovereignty Investment Program had empowered a new generation of Canadian entrepreneurs who saw domestic value addition and international diversification as paths to greater prosperity than continued dependence on American economic relationships. This generational shift in Canadian business culture meant that even future political changes would be unlikely to reverse the infrastructure investments and international partnerships that had created Canadian economic independence. The business community that had historically lobbied for closer American integration had been replaced by entrepreneurs who profited from Canadian processing capabilities and global market access. The timing of the transformation was particularly devastating for American strategic interests because it occurred simultaneously with broader shifts in global economic geography. China's rise, European integration, and the emergence of middle power coalitions were already challenging American economic dominance in other regions. Canada's successful decoupling demonstrated to other middle powers that sophisticated strategy and patient execution could create genuine alternatives to great power dependence. Australia began exploring similar strategies for reducing dependence on Chinese markets while maintaining access to Chinese resources. Brazil started developing processing capabilities that would allow direct access to global markets without American intermediation. The Canadian model was becoming a template for middle power independence that could reshape global economic relationships in ways that systematically reduced American leverage over international partners and American control over global resource flows. History will record this transformation as the moment when North American economic geography shifted from a hub and spoke model centered on American markets to a multipolar system where Canada controlled access to resources that American industries could no longer assume they would receive. The quiet decision made in that Ottawa conference room had achieved what 2 centuries of Canadian nationalism had never accomplished: economic sovereignty backed by physical infrastructure and international alternatives. The tributary relationship was over. The era of American continental dominance had ended not with conquest or collapse, but with Canadian infrastructure investments that created new realities. Most people still do not understand what has changed. The transformation occurred through budget allocations and construction projects rather than dramatic political announcements. But the foundations of continental power have shifted permanently. Canada has built the infrastructure of independence. And once built, such infrastructure does not disappear because political circumstances change or diplomatic relationships improve. The broader implications extend beyond bilateral relationships to encompass fundamental questions about how economic power functions in an increasingly multipolar world. The Canadian success in achieving genuine independence from great power domination suggests that the era of tributary relationships may be ending across multiple regions and multiple relationships. Middle powers with sophisticated strategic thinking, patient execution capabilities, and access to critical resources may no longer need to accept subordinate roles in great power economic systems. The infrastructure of independence can be built. The partnerships that provide alternatives to traditional dependencies can be negotiated. The psychology of sovereignty can be recovered even after centuries of tributary relationships. This transformation challenges one of the fundamental assumptions of American grand strategy. The assumption that geographic proximity, economic integration, and cultural similarity create permanent relationships that can be managed through diplomatic pressure and economic incentives, rather than genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared benefit. The Canadian case demonstrates that sophisticated middle powers will no longer accept tributary status simply because great powers prefer tributary relationships to genuine partnerships. When the terms of economic integration become unacceptable, alternatives can be developed that provide superior outcomes for countries willing to invest in independence rather than negotiating for better terms within systems of dependence. American strategic planners are now confronting the possibility that the Canadian transformation represents not an isolated case, but the beginning of a broader pattern that could reshape global economic relationships in ways that systematically reduce American leverage and American control over international partners. The infrastructure that Canada built cannot be dismantled because political relationships change. The international partnerships that provide alternatives to American markets cannot be dissolved through diplomatic pressure or economic incentives. The psychological transformation from tributary dependence to sovereign independence cannot be reversed through trade negotiations or security cooperation agreements. These are permanent changes that will define North American economic relationships for generations. The era of American continental dominance ended not through military defeat or economic collapse, but through Canadian infrastructure investments that created new realities on the ground. The single Canadian decision to invest in economic sovereignty rather than negotiating within American-dominated systems has created irreversible facts that will outlast political administrations, trade agreements, and diplomatic relationships. The tributary model that defined continental economics for 2 centuries has been replaced by a partnership between equals, whether American policymakers are prepared to accept that reality or not. Most people still do not understand what has changed because the transformation occurred through budget allocations and construction projects rather than dramatic political announcements. But the foundations of continental power have shifted permanently. Canada has built the infrastructure of independence. An infrastructure, once built, creates possibilities that cannot be eliminated through political pressure or diplomatic negotiation. The Quiet Revolution is complete. The consequences will unfold over decades as other middle powers study the Canadian model and consider whether tributary relationships with great powers serve their national interests, or whether alternatives might provide superior outcomes for countries willing to invest in genuine sovereignty. History records this moment as the end of an era. Not the end of American power, but the end of the assumption that American power could be exercised without regard for the interests and preferences of countries that possessed alternatives to American relationships. The age of tributary economics is over. The age of genuine partnership based on mutual benefit rather than structural dependence has begun.